well, good afternoon to those who are joining us here in Kawagoya and also to those who are joining us today on Zoom. I'm Chris Lamont, an Associate Professor of International Relations and Assistant Dean of E-Track Programs here at Tokyo International University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what is a very special Global Dialogue session today, where we have the pleasure of talking to the author of a new book published by Edward Elgar Publishing, China's New World Order, Changes in the Non-Intervention Policy, by our very own colleague here at Tokyo International University, Professor Hak Yin Li. This is an important book that explores pressing and vital questions about the future of China's foreign policy and China's role as a rising power. And before I go into some of the key questions that this book asks, I want to just once again say congratulations to Professor Li on this wonderful achievement and milestone in his research career. Now, Professor Li's book explores questions such as, what is China's non-intervention policy? What does this look like in foreign policy terms? And is China a revolutionary power that aims to recast the global order in its own image, taking a consistent stand on the question of non-intervention? Or is China a more revisionist power that aims to advance narrow national interests by working within the existing global order while compromising on its own non-intervention policy? Or alternatively, is China a revolutionary revisionist power that aims to transform global order but limits its drive at transformation through the pursuit of a more pragmatic foreign policy that constrains these revolutionary impulses? Through zooming in to three case studies, North Korea, Myanmar, and the two Sudans, so Sudan and South Sudan, Professor Li describes soft power intervention policies to illustrate how China balances bilateral ties, regional interests, and also non-traditional security challenges in crafting its approach to these countries. I think one of the aspects of this book that I enjoyed the most was the tension between principles and practice in foreign policy. And these tensions are, of course, not unique to just China. In sum, Professor Li has written a wonderful book that makes a tremendous contribution to understanding China's foreign policy and is a real delight to read. Thank you, Professor Li, for joining us. And before handing over the floor, I would just like to remind the audience that today's talk is being broadcast live on Zoom and Facebook and is being recorded. If you would like to ask a question and you're joining us virtually, you may write your question in the Q&A box or virtually raise your hand, and questions will be answered during the Q&A session. And also for those who are attending here in person in Kawagoya, you may raise your hand and ask your question during the Q&A session. Professor Li, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Lamont. Thank you so much for having me here regarding the talk. The topic here is my latest book project, but I would say that the book project actually launched more than a decade ago. The whole idea actually can trace back to sometimes in 2007. So it's a very long, period of project here. Finally, I can finish it. So regarding the book talk here, I would try to come up with my research puzzle. This is the first part, and then I would talk about some case studies here. But I guess that I would talk much more regarding the research puzzle, and I will have one case, North Korea, to be discussed because we don't have much time to go through perhaps the case of Myanmar or the two Sudans here. But definitely I will jump to the conclusion. So please allow me to do it because we don't have much time indeed. So without further delay, let me just move over. So I have different research questions in my mind, just like an onion that you try to peel off layer by layer. So the first questions that I have would be regarding China. What's the nature of the rise of China? When you refer to the rising great powers, for example, we have France in the past, we have Germany, and you can also refer to, let's say, the UK and the USA. Each great power, actually, they have their own values, norms, and principles, which they try to implement their policies, and somehow they affect every country in this world. So if you refer to France here, I guess the concept is about nation state. Britain is about balance of power. Germany is about power politics. And definitely when you come to the case of the United States, the norms and values here is about market economy, democracy, human rights here. And the question here would be, what about China? Do we have any Chinese values, norms, or principles which actually somehow would counteract American world order? So this is my first research question here. And then in the literature, you can see that we have a huge debate. So you can classify them into two different perspectives here. For example, some scholars argue that China is a revisionist power. Revisionist here, it means that China is going to upset the current status quo. It's going to challenge what we have right now. No matter this is about capability or this is the rules of order in the world, right? So this is those scholars' name here, and forgive me, I have no time to go through it one by one. But another literature here would be they call China as a status quo power. Those scholars, they trace back the transform policy from, let's say, 1990s and find that China has been socialized with the international community. And China definitely is not going to challenge the existing world order because very likely the current world order will be also part of the interest of China. So you have that kind of debate long in the literature. And we also have the third literature, which some scholars, you see the big name there, including Thomas Christensen, or let's say, Aaron Fairbairn, or even David Kent. They argue that we can look at the issues from the third perspective here. And they call this is the synthesis perspective. You try to link up the two different pictures. China is not merely a revisionist power. Non-China would be completely what we call the status quo power here. But then the problem here is that they still couldn't get into something exactly what China is. So this is the limitations of the literature. To make the things much more complicated here, don't forget that we have the Chinese voices. You have the Chinese scholars, or you have the scholars actually who study the transform policy. We have Joan Chen now in Auckland University. We have Song Xinlin from formerly People's University of China, Zhao Tingyang, William Callahan, and also Yan Shitong, Qin Yaqing. So if some of you know that literature, Zhao Tingyang actually, he proposed to study the Chinese concept Tiansha. The English translation said would be under the heaven. And Yan Shitong would be the student of Kenneth West, and then he focused on moral realism by arguing that China would be a realist power, but this is not something just for power itself, but that would be the power would be used for some better means here. And Qin Yaqing would be another professor in People's University, Foreign Affairs University, and then he published a book about relational theory of international relations here. So those scholars, what they argue here would be, we have a misunderstanding from the Western scholars and also the Western policymakers regarding the rise of China. And we have to understand this from the Chinese perspective. So for me, this is a big puzzle here regarding how to conceptualize the rise of China, the nature of the rise of China here. And then I try to recall two very distinguished scholars and policymakers here. One is Henry Kissinger. In his book, actually, one of the statements regarding the diplomacy of the book, Henry Kissinger, he said that no society has more firmly insisted on the inadmissibility of interventions in the domestic affairs of other states, and more passionately asserted that its own values were universally applicable. But this troubled me because if China is going to be another great power, very likely you will see something similar to the state. China is going to project its own norms, values, and principles, and you can see that kind of Chinese style world order in the coming future. Another scholar here would be Peter Higwist, and he said that, do the Chinese people, do they want to integrate China into the extinct world system, or do they seek to construct a separate China-centered Asian order from which to eventually challenge the West? So that's why my puzzle here would be, what kind of Chinese values, norms, and principles that they have? Are they the same with the state or with other countries in the world? If not, then do we have a crash in the coming future? So this is something that I focus here. And when you check those Chinese principles, norms, and also the behaviors, something interesting here would be, you can see from the cartoon here. But the cartoon, the gentleman actually, you can see the briefcase. So it represents the European Union. And when the EU approach China all the time, they have the human rights dialogue. Seems like China would be something very cooperative. They have been socialized by the Western community. Superficially or in appearance, China seems like a panda. But then you can see that that cartoon implies that we have the hidden agenda behind China, and you never know the Chinese intentions here. And when you try to study the Chinese foreign policy, we always find that kind of gap between principles and practice. So this is what we call the two faces of China. And we have some questions here. Is China a norm taker? If China is a norm taker, then it's fine, because China will be socialized, right? China can adapt to human rights. China can adapt to humanitarian interventions. So it's not a problem to the world. But if China is going to be a norm maker, that will be a problem. Very likely you will have the China's visions regarding different international relations issues here. Or maybe another hypothesis that we have, whether China will be just a normal great power, is going to be the same with Germany, with the UK, with the state here, just seeking for self-interest, or something between the two. So I will come back to this, set of questions later. So when you move on to the literature, then, I got my research puzzles here. It troubled me a lot, and I try to dig into the literature regarding that gap between principle and practice. And you can find relevant literatures here. For example, we have Stephen Keisner, who talks about organized hypocrisies. And if you put that back into discrepancy, inconsistencies here, basically it means that the country or the state, they have a gap between principle and practice. Stephen Keisner actually referred to the logic of appropriateness versus the logic of, what we call consequences. So basically it means that the state, even they know that they should adopt human rights policy, they should help some other people, they should prevent war, but when they refer to the logic of consequences because of the lesser interest, they're going to breach against their own principles here. So that would be quite common. And when you go further into the literature, we have different cases here. I just picked some of them here. For example, we have the case of New Zealand, we have the case of India. All of them have the original principles, but later on they breach their own principles because of different interests and concerns behind. And even if you refer to the United States, so this is something we can trace back to the American foreign policy from 1898 to 1934 by a scholar. Basically, the United States didn't respect sovereignty, didn't respect territorial integrity of other countries here, just because they want to make sure that the American backyard would be safe, would be under the American control here. So what about China? This is the question here. We have so many countries that have the same pattern of the foreign policy, which is in an organized hypocritic form here. And China, I get into another puzzle here. What are those Chinese principles, right? What are those, let's say Chinese values and norms here? And I try to conceptualize them one by one here. We have the first one, the principle of non-interference, which means that China should not intervene into other countries' internal affairs. But China has never elaborated what's that mean for internal affairs. And you also have the Chinese leaders in different generations. They talk about peaceful wise, peaceful settlement of the dispute. They talk about conflict management. They also emphasize that we're not going to be a military hegemon in the coming future. So to conceptualize all the things here, we have something like this. We have the FPPC. This is the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that would be advocated by the time during Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. But something interesting here would be Xi Jinping now still mention FPPC by saying that this is not something outdated, this is still something valid. And then in the middle here, you have Deng Xiaoping Touguo Lianghui principle, and you also have Hu Jintao peaceful development, and you also have Xi Jinping himself propose the Committee of Common Destiny. If you try to put them together with those keyword sorting and interpret those principles behind here, you can find that we have something, a high consistent pattern here. It means that one principle actually, the name is changed, but the content is the same with the previous one here. So you have a long, continuous emphasis on the same values and norms in the Chinese government and also the party. So I will come back to this later. And now we know the principles here. So what next, right? So why I have to focus on the Chinese non-intervention policy, because I would argue that if China really maintain its non-intervention policy, then you can assume that it's not likely China will become a hegemon. And China would try to argue that we respect sovereignty more than any other countries. That's why they try to contact the American influence. Is it true, right? The second rationale here, why I focus on non-intervention principle, mainly because we have other explanations behind other discrepant foreign policy in China. So that's why this is the remaining area which no scholars have if attempt to exploit the questions here. So that's why I try to dig in depth into that Chinese non-intervention policy. So the story would be very long if you go back to the Chinese non-interference principle. It is derived from the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the FPPC. And Mao Zedong at that time, he used that principle to resist American and even Soviet interventions into China's affairs, including the case of Taiwan. And Beijing actually, all the time, they intentionally make it ambiguous. I interviewed one scholar in Beijing, and then he's the scholar in the Chinese Academy of Social Science. He's the former diplomat in Africa. And then he told me that we make it intentionally ambiguous because we have more flexibility. So that will give China some leverage to deal with other countries here. But you can see that the flexibility behind China would be something much more perhaps on its own national interest concerns. So we have to, again, deconstruct that kind of, China's non-intervention policy here. And all the leaders in China, they emphasize the same principles. And you can see now the principles of non-interference, the policy itself has changed. And you have different usage regarding that policy. So in the past, that would be Taiwan. But now it's about Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and you can name it. So the problem here would be in that field, already some Chinese scholars, they notice the problem here. For example, we have, let me give you 1 or 2 examples here. Wang Yizhou would be the head of the School of IR in Beijing University. And then he published 3 volumes regarding the creative involvement to talk about the changes of China's non-intervention policy. So basically, it means that China can interfere. Sorry, I beg your pardon. This is not the very accurate statement. The correct statement here will be China should interfere into other countries' affairs when they are some sort of failed state, or when you have some public interest that we should interfere into those countries' affairs, or maybe the target country that invites China to deal with their internal affairs here. So this is what he called creative involvement. And then you have other scholars, they talk about this as the harmonious interventions here, but still they haven't really conceptualized what's the meaning for the Chinese non-intervention policy. And then you have a lot of the limitations in the literature here. We have a special volume in the China Quarterly. We have some scholars, they specifically studied the Chinese non-intervention policy in 2016, but still we haven't found out that kind of answers. So sorry that I have to go faster. Let me skip some of those issues here. And I want to show you something about the meat of the book here. So this is something you can try to reconceptualize the Chinese non-intervention policy. The policy itself would be something normative in one perspective. And it also would be something instrumental. Normative here, it means that China truly believes in that principle and they comply to that principle. But instrumental here, it means that you can help China to defend the interventions from other countries. And each time under each leadership, from Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, we find that kind of operational deviations from that principle. Just a quick example here, Mao Zedong export the Rural Revolution during the Cultural Revolution. And you can also refer to the Chinese increasing flexibility to deal with the UN-sponsored international interventions. And Xi Jinping now, what I argue in the book here would be, they try to softly intervene into other countries' internal affairs for China's interest. So that's why I try to reconceptualize all the things here. And then we have the term China's soft intervention policy. And then you have different levels here. For example, the highest level all the time would be the same with the Western interventions measurements. For example, economic sanctions and military interventions. The medium level here would be something from the Chinese style of interventions here. They try to do it through economic manipulations by encouraging those countries to develop the economy. And also they try to do some sort of diplomacy, persuade other countries to change the policy. I call this as the diplomatic persuasion here. But no matter what, they're not going to do something the same with the Western countries. It's not something that has level of interventions. So that's why we have some differences between the Western interventions and the Chinese interventions here. And I call this as the Western hard interventions versus the Chinese soft interventions. Forgive me, I have to skip the methodology here. regarding how I pick up the case of the three countries, let me go to something more important regarding the case studies here because of the time constraint. I have three cases here. I have the case of North Korea, Myanmar, and also the two Sudans. One of the reasons why I picked these three countries because or four countries if you count the two Sudans here, because they are in a long time conflict. You can trace back at least more than 2 decades. There will be too many empirical cases that you can observe the changes of China. How could Patreon deal with those three countries here? So for the case of North Korea, let me be brief. Or can I ask you a question here? Do you think that Kim Jong-un will be a friend of Xi Jinping? Not necessarily. Or any other answers here? Are they friends actually? When you talk about the China-North Korea relationship, they signed the treaty in 1950 something and China promised to defend North Korea. Do they think that they're really friends? The situation is that Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. The same time, Kim Jong-un came to power in the same year. Interestingly, Kim Jong-un requested to meet with Xi Jinping because Xi Jinping had offered some sort of legitimacies to Kim Jong-un, but Xi Jinping refused to meet with Kim Jong-un until sometime in 2018. The reasons behind here is that North Korea has never listened to the advice of China. They keep doing missile tests, nuclear tests. And one time that you have the Transport Minister Wang Yi, he talked to the North Korean counterpart by saying that we should have the deal suspensions. This is something proposed by China, by saying that the United States and South Korea, they should stop doing military exercise, and North Korea should stop doing nuclear tests or missile tests here. And North Korea didn't listen to this. And then you have the Chinese reactions here. They try to cut off the so-called friendship bridge. This bridge actually accounts more than 90% of trade between China and North Korea. And North Korea didn't listen to it. And then China cut the tourist visit to North Korea and even the seafood. So more than 80% of trade in North Korea around the time of late 2017 actually were cut off. So it drives North Korea back to the table for negotiations. And then you have Kim Jong-un to send her sister to the Olympic Games in South Korea in 2018. And somehow they have the parallel photo with American Vice President Pence, and everything changed. And then you can see that the first time that the two leaders meet would be North Korea. Kim Jong-un agreed to talk to the state, and Kim Jong-un agreed not to test further missile tests and nuclear tests here. So this picture is not something, the most interesting one. You got something like this. What's your interpretation here? You have this actually from the CCTV in China. You seldom see a state leader actually would try to drop looks, especially for Kim Jong-un. So it sounds like kind of presentations that you have the hierarchy between China and North Korea. And North Korea leader, he took the looks in front of Xi Jinping. So that would be the Chinese persuasions, the Chinese soft interventions here. And then we have the Trump-Kim summit thereafter. But do you know that how did Kim Jong-un travel to Singapore the first time? Not by train, by airplane. But the North Korean airplane actually cannot go that far because it's very outdated backward aircraft. You have Air China to fly the 747 jumbo jet for Kim Jong-un. So Kim Jong-un actually, he met with Xi Jinping before he visited or he met with Donald Trump. And when he returned, before he goes back to North Korea, he stopped over by Beijing. Once again, he met with Xi Jinping here. And the same pattern continued with the second Trump-Kim summit. And you can see the statement here, China, how China tried to manage the crisis there. So that's why it's a kind of reward here. When Kim Jong-un listened to the Chinese advice, and then you have Xi Jinping, who paid the first state visit to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong-un here. But I think that I can still go maybe half case regarding Myanmar. So I guess that all of you know about the case of Suu Kyi here, but how China interfered into the Myanmar crisis here. I know that some of you may be interested in Rohingya crisis here, but I want to talk about something on national reconsultations. You know that in Myanmar, there are 135 ethnic groups, and most of them actually engage in drug trafficking, money laundering, cross-border gambling here, because those rebel groups, they have their own weapons. They do not listen to the central government. And China somehow get affected because you have a lot of those long traditional security challenges along the border between the two countries. And one time, China offered help by summoning those local rebel groups from Myanmar to the capital of Yunnan province, Kunming. And then you have the Chinese special envoy to meet with those rebel groups leaders. And thereafter, you have the Chinese government to fight them back to attend that Pandong conference in Myanmar. If this is not about the breach of the non-intervention policy, I couldn't have another better word for that. So you can see how China deal with the issues here. The Rohingya crisis at the same time would tell you the same pattern here. You have the direct interventions from Transport Minister Wang Yi by having a very specific solution how to settle the problems of the Rohingya crisis here. So again, please allow me to skip it. So I have another case here for two Sudans, but I guess that we have no time to deal with the third case here. But let me jump to the conclusion here and some comparisons regarding the three cases here. This is a long debate in the literature, and the first ever literature that I find would be sometime in 1970s. You have Jermaine Cohen, he published an article more than 40, 50 pages with a very well-constructed, organized article to describe all the things that you have the breach of the Chinese non-intervention policy. So it's not something new actually. But what new here is that I argued it's not only in the past China didn't observe that principle, but now they claim that they observe the principle, but they try to have some more flexibilities so that they can solve those regional and international crises here. And you still have some Chinese scholars, they point out something very important here. For example, Pang Zhongying, he mentioned that, well, China wouldn't give up that principle because it's going to help China to maintain its friendly relationship with the third world countries who suffered from interventions in the past. And Jiang Chen would also say something like, I try to quote from him, the Chinese non-intervention policy stands for the nation's moral commitment to anti-imperialism, and that would be part of the Chinese soft power here. So my conclusion here, very briefly, would be that China is not going to be a revisionist power. Because if you just like the United States, if you just like another kind of Germany, no one is going to follow the Chinese foreign policy. No one is going to make friends with China. And you have no differences between China and the state. And of course, if you're going to be a lawmaker, right, I guess that would be very difficult for Beijing because no one actually truly believes in that kind of principles regarding FPPC, coming from destiny here. And more likely, right now, what I argue is that China is a self-restrained power. They understand that we have a dilemma to maintain that long-intervention policy, but at the same time, you want to have more flexibility to deal with other regional crises and international issues here. So that principle somehow constrains the Chinese foreign policy options, and it also constrains the potential Chinese hegemonic behavior. Because if you somehow become much more assertive, aggressive to other countries, very likely you will hurt the Chinese soft power itself, and you can no longer differentiate between China and the United States here. So that would be something more from the three cases here. You can see that they have different interests and different factors that shaped the Chinese non-intervention policy behind. But ultimately, what we find is that even the three cases will be very different in terms of geographical locations. You have different interests of China in those countries, but still China follow the same policy. Basically, they haven't breached the principles of non-interference, but the claims that we have the operational flexibilities. They try to softly interfere into those countries by solving those regional crises here. So that would be something comparison here. The conclusion, very briefly, the first thing here is that I argue the Chinese leaders, they haven't able to manage when you have the existing traditional normative principles, but on the other side, you have the emerging national interest. They find this something very difficult to cope with, but then they do not want to get rid of that principles, so they get stuck somehow at this stage. And the second thing here would be when you have the compromise here, very likely it shows that the principles, norms, and values are not something on top priority. China will be more flexible than any other countries regarding diplomatic stance, regarding diplomatic negotiations, is what I argue. But they would put something in a very rigid banner. This is the principle here, but basically they have some more flexibilities to deal with different issues here. And the third thing here would be the literature has long underestimated the importance of the principles of China, but now you can see that how that principle constrain the Chinese foreign policy or their options. And the last one here basically would be something from my interviews in Beijing. It dates back to 2017 and also 2016. And those scholars in Beijing, some of them close to the government, they argue that this is not something that you can touch regarding how to modify that Chinese non-interference principle, because you have a very long tradition for the Chinese diplomats and the party cadres to follow the previous predecessors' policies. You're not going to bitch it, but somehow you know how to play around that principle, and then you have some operational flexibility. So that would be something interesting comment from the scholars in Beijing. So sorry that I cannot go to the case of two Sudans, but let me stop here. We can talk about this further in the Q&A sections. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Li. That was a wonderful presentation of the core arguments of the book. And with that, I think I'll open up the floor to questions. I do see we have questions right now that are coming to us on Zoom. So I guess we can begin there with a question from Rangga Muhammad Sada from Saputra Pasundan University in Indonesia, who has 3 questions that relate to Taiwan. And the first is asking about this kind of the question of the security dilemma that China finds itself in and what China is doing in relation to improving its own security situation, fueling Taiwan's insecurity, and especially in the context of kind of intrusions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. How do we account for this? And his next question, or the next question is, how is the perception of this threat to Taiwan regarding People's Liberation Army and Liberation Army Navy from kind of across kind of Taiwanese territory, kind of in the context of cross-strait relations, kind of how does that impact relations? And also, how does China's foreign policy dominance in the Blue Water Navy affect dynamics of cross-strait relations?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, the first thing here is that from the Chinese perspective, Taiwan is definitely and 100% for sure the internal affairs of the Chinese government. And next, if you refer to the statement from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they call the Taiwan Strait actually would be the inner water area of China rather than something international water. And definitely it will be criticized by the United States. So regarding that kind of dilemma here, what you call here regarding that kind of military confrontations between China and Taiwan, the first implication is that China is doing some sort of diplomatic signaling. Because if you refer to the conflict between the cross-strait relationship here, you have some other countries behind. You have Japan, you have the United States. Japan recently just announced that anything happen in Taiwan would also be something about Japan. That would be a keynote actually, which somehow differ from the Japanese traditional foreign policy, I would argue this way. And it means that China fundamentally does not want to have a war immediately with Taiwan. And regarding the second question, something similar is that China does not yet have that kind of blue water capability. Because we lack that kind of weather cover, the air fighter actually would be in danger, the aircraft carrier would be in danger without that kind of long-range cover of the radar system. And the South China Sea base is just going to offer that kind of protection to the aircraft carrier and also the air fighter. So that's why China hesitated to get back Taiwan, I would argue this way. Very likely in the long run, they would try to just contain the situations in Taiwan and warn the United States, you have to take care of Taiwan, otherwise then we are going to unify Taiwan by force here. So it's a kind of diplomatic signaling rather than a real struggle between the two entity, China versus Taiwan. And the last one here, when you refer to whether that kind of blue water capability has anything to do with Taiwan, I would say not necessarily. Right now, what China needs, if they really want to get back Taiwan, the first one will be the amphibious forces. The second one will be the capability to blockade the Taiwan Strait. If they can do these two things, you have nothing to do with the blue water capability. So you also have the Dongfeng missiles, DF-17, that would be the hypersonic missiles which can deter the potential interventions of the American aircraft carrier in Taiwan Strait. So I guess that everything would be something regional, only about Taiwan, but not something about the blue water capability. But thanks for this question, they're very interesting.
And we have another question from Zoom, this time from a student at Tokyo International University, Christopher Halim, who is also asking about Taiwan. And he asks, as recent news suggests, China is still holding on to their desire to reclaim Taiwan. Seeing that China is rising up to become more than just a regional power, their capability to do so increases as well. What purpose would the reclamation of Taiwan serve the Chinese government, seeing that mainland China has their economy kind of, as this has increased by leaps and bounds over the past decade? Wouldn't any conflict in the East Asia theater jeopardize their growth?
Thank you for these questions again. It seems like Taiwan is the hot topic here. So, but the first thing is about legitimacies. All the time, if you refer to the China status, the main goal of them is to reunify with Taiwan. So this is about the legitimacies of the party, and it justifies how the leaders can maintain their regime in front of the people in China. So this is the first thing. And of course, Taiwan will have other kind of strategic, let's say, implications behind. For example, if you can get back Taiwan, it means that you can have a very good starting point to get into the first island trend and the second island trend here. You can also refer to the potential Taiwanese capability to producing the computer chips. I guess that is not every people that concerning the computer chips productivity in Taiwan, which can help the state. And the state would also protect Taiwan because of that kind of considerations here. But I mean, I would say that the most important factor still would be about nationalisms, it's about the legitimacy of the party. And that would be the major considerations behind the Chinese government. And something that you may want to look is that Xi Jinping just claims that they have completed the first centennial goal. And the second centennial goal would be coming. So the first one would be the 1921, we have the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. And the second one would be the 1949, the establishment of the People's Republic of China. So that's why the people wonder Taiwan would be that kind of symbol to complete that second centennial goal in China. So I guess that, everything about Taiwan definitely is about the prestige, reputations, nationalisms, legitimacies in China. So we still have that, potential of conflict. But as I argued before, it's not that, perhaps what's timing now, because China still gets stuck in some of those brutal capabilities here. Thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience before we continue answering questions from Zoom? Professor Shin from Tokyo International University.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Hak Yin, for the wonderful presentation. Well, I'm sure, I would find some time to read your work, but I have really many questions, but maybe I can just ask you a couple of questions. The first question is about the source of foreign policy change in China. Well, while hearing you, I was thinking of if you put more exogenous factors or external factors that affected the foreign policy change in China rather than the domestic leaders, their ideas or their ideation of persuasion. So how do pandemic and following economic downturn actually affect China's foreign policy in the near future? That is my first question. And my second question is about the case election. Well, you explained the North Korea's relationship with China, but I want to know why you actually picked the three cases. And I want to also know whether among the other developing countries that China has built a good relationship, or the foreign policy persuasion, whether there are any other developing countries showing the similar patterns with these three cases, except North Korea, Myanmar, and Sudan.
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Shin. The first question regarding the source of foreign policy, yes, we have different sources, both domestic and international here. So from my book, I also consider domestic factors will be one of the sources that drive those changes here. But seems like when you refer to the external sources, they are more powerful and more compelling than the domestic factors. And most of the time, they don't want to change that policy just because of the external reasons behind. And regarding the economic downturn with domestic factors, right, suggesting perhaps something, I guess, would China divert the internal discontent with more assertive foreign policy over Taiwan, perhaps, or maybe in South China Sea? But I would say that all the time they have this pattern here. If you refer to those conflicts between China and Japan over Yasukuni Shrine, if you refer to the crash of the airplane between China and the state over, Hainan Island or South China Sea, most of the time, the Chinese government will become something very assertive only at the very beginning of the crisis. Because this is something appealing to the people in China, it's going to be satisfying their expectations here. But sometime later, they will just back off because they know that they're not going to provoke the United States. They do not dare to challenge other countries here. So that would be that kind of pattern. Well, I guess that this is something they really want to do because of the domestic factors, legitimacies, expectations of the people, nationalism here. But it's not going to last that long. Still, the Chinese leaders are very rational in that sense. And we have different cases starting from late 1990s. The first one that you can refer to, the American bombardment of the Yugoslavian, the Chinese embassies in Yugoslavia, that would be in Belgrade, and then the crash of the EPV with the J-8. And even just now, between China and Canada, China and Australia, regarding that kind of scramble of the air fighter over different parts of the world. But they still have the same pattern here. This one, I'm pretty sure they're not going to do anything irrational. And then the second question regarding case selections here. Why North Korea, Myanmar, and two Sudans? Because there's something unique and special here. We have other cases from South countries. For example, we have Afghanistan. You can also refer to Venezuela. You can also refer to now the case of Ukraine. But, well, the case of Ukraine actually would be out of my scope because the book was published already. Definitely, that would be another topic if we want to do it. But Afghanistan, actually, we have one scholar from the Jamaica University, and she has published an article regarding how Chinese mediations in Afghanistan. So that would be something already filled by someone. But we lack that kind, the journal articles actually with only 8,000 words to 10,000 words here. We lack something really in-depth policy tracing case studies regarding a whole country for, let's say, more than 2 decades. So my case study actually will be very long, in more than 1 decade or at least 2 decades here. And I couldn't find other cases actually would be that critical to China because they are something posting tremendous security challenges to Beijing. So that's why that would be the 3 best cases I would suggest to tackle, to test whether China has breached or some of the factors that force China to breach that long interference principle. But thank you, very good questions. Thank you.
We have, Professor Yashita from Tokyo International University, Dean of the Track Program.
Thank you. And Professor Hak Yin Li, thank you so much for your presentation. I have 2 questions, but I'm not really sure if I understood you correctly. So let me just clarify what you argued. The first question is about intervention. You mentioned that the Chinese principle of non-intervention has been changing and toward more of a soft intervention. But I wasn't really clear about the distinction between soft intervention and hard intervention. Maybe the Chinese case would fall into the soft intervention, but the Western case of intervention would be categorized as a hard intervention. Is that true of categorization? If so, what's the distinction? And the second question is, if I understand you correctly, you mentioned that China as a rising power is no different from countries like US or Germany, the past rising powers. I think you're right, but I think the question and the questions that many people are talking about is whether the rise of China poses a threat to the existing global order. I think the rise of Germany and rise of Japan in Asia Pacific in the 1930s certainly pose a major security challenge with the existing great powers. So from that perspective, the question may not be so much about whether China is different from other countries, but the question is whether the rise of China is actually posing a threat. And how do you answer to that question? Is my second question.
Well, thank you, Professor Miester. Regarding the first question, in the literature of intervention here, we have different categories. For example, we have fair fight interventions, we have economic interventions, we have military interventions. But most of them actually will be considered as something hard because you try to make use of the economic capability to drive one country to change the policy. And this to mention the case of military interventions here. That would be, some scholars call this as the transformative interventions here, because you have your military forces into that country, and then you change the types of the government, the regime of that government here. So that would be something hard interventions. And from the Chinese government diplomatic statement, and also the Chinese scholars' view, there are questions about that kind of Western hard interventions. And the most disputable thing would be China rejects to have any regime change because that would be upsetting that country's sovereignty and regime security. So that's why China behaves very differently. And you have China to adopt a soft intervention policy. And that soft intervention policy would not be something available now in the literature. So this is something I try to conceptualize by myself through those three cases here, and I put them into two categories. You have the economic manipulations, and then you have the diplomatic persuasions here. Economic manipulations here, it means that China fundamentally believes that why those countries, they have problems, because those countries, they have insufficient economic development. If we get back to the case of Rohingya crisis, or let's say the Myanmar ethnic dispute, or even North Korea, China thinks that why those countries get a problem? Because they do not have sufficient economic development. So that's why China all the time will try to first offer economic package to those countries. And second, China also try to persuade those countries to adopt economic reforms. For example, Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, he visited China more than 11 times. And in those 11 times when he visited China, he went to Shenzhen, he went to Shanghai, and when Kim Jong-il went back to North Korea, he would say that we try to adopt the Chinese economic development here. The same case to Myanmar, the same case to the two Sudans here. Because this is the fundamental thinking from the Chinese perspective, it's not about the ethnic issues in Myanmar. It's not about the resources issues in the two Sudans. You have oil, you have natural gas here. So that's why they want to intervene into that countries through economic manipulations here. And diplomatic persuasions would also be something different from the Western hard interventions here. One time we have the Chinese special envoy to Sudan, Liu Guizheng. He made a very interesting statement by saying that all the people, they want to eat the cost, right? The Western people use fork, Chinese people use chopstick, African people use hand. Why we have to use something hard here? So what he referred to that context would be, we can refer to dialogue. We can refer to consultations to solve those regional crises here. And the only thing that they do not want to do is the Western hard interventions. No sanctions, because sanctions would hurt those ordinary people. And no military intervention, because that would upset that regime security. So this is the differences between soft and hard interventions here. The second question here, regarding whether China would be a threat to other countries, what I try to argue here is that China is a self-restrained power. You can imagine like this. China has no difference with the United States, with other countries, because you concern the national interest. You have different kinds of emerging national interests overseas. But the problem here is that if you just act like the United States, African countries, they're not going to follow China. Latin American countries, they're going to leave China. Why? Because you have no differences between China and the United States. They do not want to have another American hegemony in their region. China understands that, and China has a very strong identity regarding we're part of the South country. And that's why they refer to the same history, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism here. They do not want to do something the Western countries do upon them. So because of that principle, because of that necessity to differentiate between China and the United States, somehow China's behavior will be constrained. And I don't think that China would be a kind of threat to other countries unless China give up that principle. And it means that China has determined to be a fully very Western power politics hegemonic power. If not, I guess that China is not going to be a threat to other countries. And one more thing would be, if China becomes too assertive here, very likely you will drive other countries on the side of the United States. That will be the bandwagoning. And we already see this happen for the Ukrainian crisis. You have Sweden, Denmark, right? They already joined the hands of EU and also NATO. So that would be my answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have another question from another colleague here at Tokyo International University, but this time virtually, Professor Medler Mema, who has asked a question in the chat. And he asks, or he states, some have questioned what China's endgame is, regional hegemony or global hegemony. It has been pointed out that historically speaking, China seems to have been satisfied with regional hegemony. However, constructivist literature on state learning opens up a possibility that US global hegemony may have provided a model for China's leadership. What are your thoughts?
Okay. Thank you so much from Professor Media. Well, that would be a very interesting question here. If you allow me to go straight forward, I would say that China would like to be a regional hegemony. The reason here is that the cost is too high. If you want to be a global hegemony, let's say the blue water capability, you have a lot of those investment, and how can you build up those overseas bases here? So let's say the United States, they got more than 8 or 9 aircraft carrier battle groups. The cost is so high for maintaining that kind of military presence in the region and in different parts of the world. And at the same time, if you refer to the military bases, China now got 1 in Djibouti, but the United States got more than 600 overseas military bases. This is a long gap. This is not something China can compete with the state. And if you go back to Deng Xiaoping's era, I guess that Xi Jinping still, think about this is something correct here, because Deng Xiaoping concerns about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they addressed the Toguanyanghui diplomacy, the low-profile diplomacy. And right now, you have Jiang Zemin to suggest we have the Yaoso Zhuowei, which means that we want to do something a little bit more, but not meaning that we're going to be the global hegemon, so that we can protect our own national interests here. They know the limit, they know their scope. And definitely they want to be a regional hegemon, but it doesn't mean that they want to challenge the United States. Another thing, if you refer to the Chinese scholars who are close to the government, all the time they would say that they welcome the United States presence in the region more than they leave the region. Because if you have the American withdrawal of the influence in the region, you have South Korea, Japan, definitely they're going to rearm by themselves, and this will hurt China's interest. So that's why I think that China more likely would be the regional hegemon rather than the global hegemon here. And that kind of American example, which would be something, is it something appealing to China? I think no, because when you refer to the statement from the Chinese leaders, if you truly believe in them, first of all, Hu Jintao talks about the peaceful rise of China. And they want to escape this kind of Thucydides trap, which the Western power politics scholars emphasize here. And then you have Xi Jinping, he met with Obama in 2012 by saying that the Pacific Ocean is large enough to accommodate 2 powers. And he also said that we want to have the new type of great power relationship. International relations should not be something all the time, the Western power politics. And then you have the Chinese scholars that talk about relational theory, tensor system here. So I guess the problem here is not something China wants to be a global hegemon, but they have a problem to convince the Westerners. We are only a regional power. We don't have the ambitions. But most of the time, the Westerners or the other countries, they couldn't believe in it. So I think this is the fundamental problem here, rather than something about global hegemon. But thank you. This is a very interesting question here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have another question from the Zoom audience, this time from Quan Tran Nguyen, who asks about the main argument of the book, China being a self-restrained power. Juan asks, is China really a self-restrained power? If we look at what is happening in the South China Sea, where the power asymmetry is immense, its constabulary coercion is increasingly aggressive, directly related to its increasing military aggression. Most recently, the intercept of the PLA of the P-8 ISR aircraft from Australia.
Yeah. Well, this is another excellent question here, because most of the time you can see the Chinese behavior becomes much more assertive here. And then it recalled my memory that we have one scholar, his name is Alistair Ian Johnston. He published an article in International Security in 2013 by selecting 7 major cases that the Western mass media regard the Chinese assertive behavior. And what he finds is that this is not that assertive at all. And then we have another trust scholar, Fan Ning. He published in International Affairs, and he argues that if you look at those empirical evidence, as I also provide examples regarding at the very beginning of the conflict, China would be something assertive, but later on they would back off. That would be what they call the strategic restraint here. Because they know the limitations, and they want to do something so that you can deter the others, including the example that you offer, the P-8 actually from Australia would be somehow intercepted by the J-11 from China here. But the whole story here, you have to understand that we have some differences between a truly assertive foreign policy versus what we call diplomatic signaling. Diplomatic signaling is another literature, is now going up in the academic field, and we have more countries that are adopting diplomatic signaling, which try to present some false information in order to exaggerate. Seems like they're going to be assertive so that you can deter the other countries. So this is the strategic misrepresentation of the information you see. So all the time you can go back to that kind of deterrence theory or that kind of rationality here. How could they try to allocate the information and put it something more exaggerated form here? And I think right now we have a general impression that China is now becoming much more assertive. But if you can give me 1 or 2 critical cases by saying that China has already intruded into another country's territory, or China has actually controlled another port for their military bases, for sure, I guess that would be something much more convincing. Personally, I'm fine. If you would find that kind of cases, I would agree with you. But to be objectively speaking here, I haven't found that kind of critical cases you can justify by saying that China is that assertive. But from another perspective, people will argue that the United States is not becoming much more assertive. You have the alliance between US, UK, Australia. You have the Indo-Pacific, strategy becoming something much more organized here. So from the Chinese perspective, I guess that it's the United States to become much more assertive rather than China. And you have Joe Biden openly to say that they're going to offer protection to Taiwan. I guess that, well, again, I don't have any preference here, but I'm just trying to judge from those cases here. But well, let's see what happened. But thank you so much for that question.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question. I think I might kind of use that time to ask a question that I had after having read this book. When I initially started, and the title was really ambitious, which caught my attention, China's New World Order. And having looked at the case studies, one of the kind of sub-themes that comes out throughout the text is almost it's kind of China meets kind of Calder and New Wars, right? China's confrontation of non-traditional security threats, challenging that non-interventionist policy. And the question that I was left with was more in light of recent events, right? Russia's June 24th invasion of Ukraine, and Xi Jinping and Putin coming together and declaring this kind of no upper limits partnership, nothing is forbidden. And you talked a lot about China's uneasiness with US hard interventions, but kind of with Ukraine, a United Nations member state, also subject to kind of military intervention. How do you see China's foreign policy changing in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah.
Is it going to cause a fundamental shift in kind of what you've described here, or are we going to see these trends that you've identified in your book continue to play out?
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lamont. But this is again another very hot debate nowadays. Someone talked about this today, Ukraine, tomorrow, Taiwan, something like that. And then you have the Chinese. Seems like, well, I got some students ask me before by saying that China, on one hand, by saying that we respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. China really said that in the diplomatic statement. But on the other hand, China also added something second, would be something like, we also want other countries to pay attention to the Russian concerns here. They have their own claims, which is something reasonable. So I think if you put that back into my analytical framework here, we still have something the same. We do not have much fundamental shift here. because China cannot differ too much from that general principles regarding non-interference policy. You still have to recognize the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries here. Otherwise, very likely other countries they're going to challenge you over Taiwan, right? So you cannot just go too far away. But then, they want to work out some sort of, operational differentiations here, or you can call flexibility. They try to do something at the back. But so far, I couldn't find much that kind of evidence regarding how China talked to Russian President Putin. Very likely because Putin would be a very determined person here, and when you refer to the stay of Putin in Patriot Games less than 24 hours here, I don't think the two leaders actually they have much communications beforehand. So that would be somehow put Xi Jinping or China into a kind of dilemma here, because if you stand too close to Russia, China will be sanctioned very likely, and they're discussing how to avoid that kind of American sanctions on the Chinese companies. But if you try to deviate too much from your interference policy, then Russia definitely would become your enemy or your opponent here. This is not China wants, but you also do not want to get too close with Russia. So that would be something that China somehow keeps some distance with the issues here, and you can refer to Wang Yi all the time. He refers to dialogue, consultations here. We want to have all parties get into a table and negotiate. But my last point here would be, if you refer to the cases regarding North Korea, Myanmar, and the two Sudans here, something interesting here would be, I don't have time to elaborate. North Korea, you have much more direct Chinese interventions because Xi Jinping would have an upper hand over Kim Jong-un. But most of the time, even you have the meeting between Xi Jinping and Aung San Suu Kyi before she was, launched by the coup d'etat, China seems to have some sort of distance between Myanmar and the two Sudans. For example, China referred to ASEAN to deal with the cases in Myanmar, and China refers to the IGA, intergovernmental agencies of African countries to deal with the cases in the two Sudans here. You can see that they want to keep some distance, but not getting too much trouble with those countries here, so that you can solve the issues, but then you're not going to breach too much regarding that non-interference principle. So I guess that right now China is doing the same thing to Russia. But definitely, I guess that the remaining questions here would be, we have the effectiveness problem here. Because when you refer to the soft interventions, definitely it's not that effective when you compare with the Western interventions policy. It's not economic sanctions, it's not military interventions here. You cannot achieve much. So that would be the major limitations of the Chinese soft intervention policy.
Thank you very much for that. And it's probably something that we'll see being tested in the coming days with recent events in North Korea, missile tests, and prospective potential nuclear tests. Thank you so much, Professor Li. Congratulations once again on this wonderful book, China's New World Order. Recommend you all take a look at it. And for those on Zoom, maybe acquire it for your institution's libraries as well. It was a great honor to be here to moderate this session. And I invite you all back to our next Global Dialogue session, which will be taking place on July 5th. And the speaker will be Professor Tom Lee from Pomona College in California, who will be presenting on his recently published book by Columbia University Press, Japan's Aging Peace. So he'll be looking at pacifism and Japan's security identity, and that's coming up next month. So I look forward to seeing many of you back soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.